Hello, everybody, and welcome to our very first GMAT Club Executive Assessment 101 presentation. I am Ryan Starr, and it's nice to be here with you. I've been teaching the EA not since the beginning of the EA, but since fairly early on in the EA's history. When it was around for about a year, I took it. I've been teaching it ever since. So since around the end of 2017, I guess that makes me an expert in the EA world. I don't know. I doubt it. But I'm the only expert you've got. So here we go. What I want to talk about, you guys, as we discuss the EA is, what is the EA? What's on it? How is it structured? How does the scoring on the EA work? What do schools even want out of your score? All right, talk about all of those things, and we're going to talk about all of them up front. We may even get into some of the details about the kinds of questions you'll see on the EA in the various sections. It will depend on time, and it will depend, of course, on your questions. You guys can ask questions throughout the broadcast. I will try to answer as many as I can, unless they're ridiculous questions. No, I'm kidding. Ask all the questions you want, you guys. All right. And again, welcome. Let's talk about how the EA is structured. So for those of you who are coming to the EA through the GMAT world, the EA is way better than the GMAT. It has less to do, fewer sections really than the in-person GMAT, at least, shorter sections for the most part, and the wonderful ability to go back and forth within a section. You don't have to answer the question you're on only to never see it again the way you have to on the GMAT. The EA is a much friendlier exam. All right, these are the three sections. Now, those of you who know the GMAT know that these three sections, at least nominally, are on the GMAT as well, right? There's an integrated reasoning section every time, verbal section every time, quant section every time. Notably missing from the GMAT sections on the EA will be the essay section. There is no essay to write on the EA. The EA is 90 minutes, as you see there, straight through, no breaks, no essay, all multiple choice. Okay, so one advantage over the GMAT, if you're not much of an essay writer, as I myself am not, no essay to worry about here. One difference, though, between the GMAT and the EA is that where on the GMAT, the IR section, most people feel counts a little bit less. It's a bit less important than the other two sections in terms of determining your overall score and getting you into the school. On the EA, the IR section is just as important as the other two sections. These are three equally weighted sections. And so the IR may well deserve a bit more attention from you if you're studying for the EA than if you are studying for the GMAT. And you guys, indeed, as you see there in the comments window, if you have questions, put them in the comments. I'll try to catch them and answer them. Right. There are no breaks on the EA, so it's 30 minutes on one section, then straight through to the next section, and then again straight through. If you take under 30 minutes on any one section, let's say you finish the verbal section in 27 minutes and you have 3 minutes left, you can move on early to the quant section, the final section at that point, but you don't get to take the 3 minutes with you. So each section is up to 30 minutes, but there are no rollover minutes or anything like that. So it's usually in your best interest to take all 30 of the minutes on the section that you are on. We'll talk about how to do that in just a minute. If you are taking it in person at a test center, you'll get your scores right away at the end of the exam. All right. If you're taking it online, however, you're going to have to wait a little while to get your scores. Now, officially, they say you'll wait 7 days to get your scores. Unofficially, though, pretty much everybody who's taken the test online over the last months has received a score within about 3 days. So if you're trying to think about when you want to schedule the test, especially with respect to your school deadlines, you may not need to schedule it a full 7 days out. And honestly, a lot of schools will let you schedule a test for after their deadline. Just talk to your schools and see what they say. All right. But if you're able to take it in person, you'll get a score the same day. And that means you could be taking it the very same day the application is due and just self-report your scores right there. Okay. Now, how does this all break down? Start with the integrated reasoning section. Right. Notice that 30 minutes long, we already said that, 12 questions long, which is different from the other two sections, and it's got a score on a scale of 2 to 18 points. This is a bit different from the official line on the EA. The official line is you can get anywhere from 0 to 20 points per section, but practically speaking, that's not true. It's impossible to get less than a 2 on a section. It's impossible to get more than 18, okay? And for that matter, and you may have noticed this on the last slide, but it's changed on this slide, they say that the range of scores is from 100 to 200 points. It's not, but I'm going to go over that in some more detail at the end of this slide, so stay tuned. All right, integrated reasoning, 12 questions. Now, each of the sections on the EA is broken up into 2 what are called stages, 2 halves, okay? And that's an important breakup because here's how it plays out. On the first 6 questions, the first stage in integrated reasoning, you got 6 questions, and you are free to move backward and forward, as we mentioned, through those 6 questions. You can skip question 1 and start with question 2 if you want to, which, by the way, is often a good idea because question 1, no matter how good you are at these tests, no matter how well you've studied, the very first question on a test is likely to throw you a little bit, all right? If that happens to you on test day, don't worry about it. Don't think, oh man, all my studying was for nothing. I'm going to go into a tailspin now. It's all going to be terrible. No, none of that. If you find that your mind goes immediately blank on question 1, just skip to question 2. And if it's still blank-ish, go to question 3. Eventually, in that first stage, you're going to find a problem that feels like, okay, deep breath, I can handle this. And that will be your foot in the door. That'll get momentum going, and the rest will be okay. And when I say it can happen to anybody, I mean, the last time I took a GMAT, having taught it for 15 years at that point, I saw my first question, mind went totally blank, couldn't even comprehend the words. And I wasn't nervous about the test, and I'm very well practiced, but there's something about that first question that knocks you back a little bit. Don't let yourself tailspin if that happens to you. Just know it's normal. And on the EA, it doesn't even matter. Skip ahead, come back to the first question, answer it when you're more warmed up, and it'll be a totally different experience. Now, at the end of these 6 questions, you will get a review screen. Okay, naturally. So you finish question 6, they'll take you to a review screen. You can also access this review screen at any point during these 6 questions. There will be a button on the screen that says review screen, right? Or review. And you'll go there and it'll tell you basically of these 6 questions, which ones you've completed versus left incomplete, and which ones you have marked for review if you so choose, versus not marked for review. So among your many options on the top bar of the screen as you're taking the test will be review, to go to that review screen, mark for review, so that when you get to that review screen, you can see which ones you've marked to come back to. You can choose to hide the timer. And on the integrated reasoning section, you'll also have a button up at the top of the screen that says calculator, which when clicked will produce an on-screen calculator that you can use. It's kind of a clumsy calculator, but there are definitely times when it will save you a massive amount of time and effort on the integrated reasoning section. And for that matter, the integrated reasoning section is the only section that has the calculator. So might as well use it while you have it. You're going to want it in quant, you won't get it there. Use it in IR. Why not? All right. Once you finish question 6 or go to the review screen, in the bottom right corner, there's going to be a button that basically says finalize, confirm, and move on, right? It won't say all that. That would be a very big button, but basically it'll say something along the lines of finalize. So once you've decided you've done those 6 questions, you've gone back and revisited any of them that you wanted to, cleaned up some things, etc., you have to tell that review screen, all right, I am definitively finished with these 6 questions. You click that button, there will be a pop-up in the middle of the screen that says, are you sure? You can never go back and think about your future. Not exactly that, but it's kind of an intense message that makes it seem like you're doing something wrong in clicking to go ahead. You're probably not. But they want to make it really clear that once you finalize that stage, those 6 questions, it becomes set in stone. It is irrevocable at that point, okay? You go on to the next stage, the next 6 questions, and that stage is going to be determined somewhat by your performance on the first stage. And that's why once you say you're finished with the first 6 questions, you're never coming back. So in much the way the GMAT will question by question adapt to your ability level, the EA will do the same, but rather than doing it question by question, it does it half section by half section. So if you do really well in the first 6 questions, you qualify for the harder second stage in IR. And if you qualify for the harder second stage, that's how you can unlock the highest scores in the IR section, the 18s, the 15s, the 14s, even the 13s. These are all really, really good scores on the IR section, okay? If you instead get a couple wrong in the first stage, maybe you get 2, 3 wrong in the first stage, you're probably getting the medium second stage. And you can still do pretty well on the IR section if you get the medium second stage. Now, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the questions will be by and large easier in the medium second stage than in the hard second stage. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But the thing that may be surprising is that the way these tests work, the EA and the GMAT specifically, if you get a hard question wrong, your score doesn't suffer very much for it, right? The test maker says, well, yeah, but that was a hard question. Like, who could blame you? It's almost as though each question's graded on a curve a little bit, and the harder the question, less you pay for getting it wrong. If you get an easier question wrong, conversely, you pay more, right? So it can be nice to get the medium second stage in IR. It will somewhat cap your score level. Like if you're getting the medium second stage, you probably can't score above 13, maybe 14, depending on how that first stage goes. So it'll cap your score level. It'll feel easier as you're doing it, but the caveat there is because it feels easier, because the questions are easier, if you happen to get one of them wrong because of time management, because of careless mistakes, anything like that, you pay a bigger price for it in the medium section. Okay, that gives rise to one of the great general strategies on the EA, and this is going to hold throughout the sections for most people. Okay, unless you're doing really well on some of these sections or really badly on some of these sections. If you're scoring somewhere in the middle, like you find when you take practice tests, you're scoring somewhere between 8 and 12 on the sections, generally speaking. The best time management strategy is to spend a little bit of extra time on the first stage in any given section. So those first 6 questions, theoretically, you'd want to spend about 15 minutes on them. You have 30 minutes for the section. There are 2 halves, right? But in practicality, you probably want to spend more like 16, 17, even 18 minutes on the first half, if spending that extra time will better guarantee that you get those questions right. Okay, if you're just spending time to spend time, but you have no real hope on the questions, don't do it. Just move on to the second half. But if you think that with some extra time, you'll be able to do some things that you might not ordinarily do under time pressure and things like that, that's an appropriate effort to make in the first half. The more you can do in the first half of a section to get yourself into the harder second half, the more you can then coast through the harder second half of the section. So one of the consequences of the fact that getting hard questions wrong doesn't hurt your score so much is that you can afford to get more questions wrong in the hard section. And that means that you don't even have to necessarily be attempting every question in the hard second stage, which is particularly important if you spend extra time on the first half. If you spend, say, 17 minutes on the first half of IR, and you do really well for that extra time, you get the harder second half, well, then you've only got 13 minutes left to spend on what should theoretically take you even longer than the first half, because while the first half had some easy questions in it, the second half is going to be pretty uniformly difficult, right? So what does that mean for you practically? It means if you're going into the hard second half and you've got 13 minutes left, you're looking to maybe do about 4 of the questions there, like put serious effort into 4 of the questions. What about the other 2? Just guess on them. So one of the things you can do if you've got about 13 minutes left for the second half is cycle through those 6 questions in the second half. See which 3 or 4 look easiest to you. See which ones look like your jam. Guess on the other 2 or 3, and then just focus on those ones that you thought, yeah, I have a really good chance of getting this one right about. Okay. You do not have to try to do every problem on this exam. Even if you're trying to do pretty well on the exam, you don't have to try to do every problem. But a little bit of strategy goes a long way. And in general, the first halves of sections are more important than the second halves because they can be such mixed difficulty affairs. All right. Okay. Once you finish the IR section, at the end of the second stage, you'll again get a review screen. You can go back and revisit any of those 6 questions and make any final changes you want to make. Once you finish that, your performance there, your score level is going to determine the difficulty, starting difficulty that is, of the verbal section that comes immediately after the IR section, but also of the quant section that will come at the end. The rationale being that integrated reasoning has some quant stuff, has some verbal stuff, and so it's a good way of gauging maybe where you should be starting on quant and verbal. Okay. Rolling it back a little bit to verbal. Again, scored on a scale of 2 to 18 points. That's going to be true for quant as well. This time, though, in verbal and in quant, you're going to have 14 questions per section, which means the first stage is going to be 7 questions, and the second stage is going to be 7 questions, of course. But beyond that, the mechanics are more or less the same. You can move freely about the first 7 questions in verbal, get to review screen, finalize those 7 questions, that stage, and then you go on to the next 7 questions. And the second half of verbal, the difficulty there is determined only, exclusively, by the first half of verbal. So no matter where you start on verbal, which is to say, no matter where you end up on integrated reasoning, if you start in the easy section of verbal, if you start in the harder section of verbal, start in the medium, you can still go on in the second verbal stage to the hard part, and you could still theoretically get a perfect score, even if you bomb IR, do a really, really bad job there, and come to verbal and you're starting off in the easy section down here. It's not to say that, like, from the easy section, you could only graduate to the medium section, and so your score is going to be necessarily limited by a bad IR performance. Not at all. I had a student once who took the course, did pretty well, went to take the real test, though, and for whatever reason, bombed IR, got a 6 as his IR score, which is going to qualify you for the easier starting difficulty on verbal and on quant. But then he went on to get an 18 on verbal, a perfect score on verbal. So his not so great IR performance in no way hampered his potential for success on the other 2 sections, okay? Which is to say, even though it looks like IR exerts a lot of influence over the other 2 sections, de facto it doesn't. It just determines where you're going to start, and that can help determine some strategic things as well. Like if you know you do badly in IR, just generally speaking, then you kind of plan to start with the easier or medium section on verbal and quant, and that's going to mean that you definitely need to spend more time on that first half and make sure you get everything there right. Because as we said, get an easy question wrong, even if you just get it wrong by like mistake or on a tiny technicality or something. It's a multiple choice test. They don't know why you got it wrong. They just see right versus wrong. If you get an easy question wrong, it's going to cost you disproportionately your score. So you spend some extra time if you know you're doing kind of badly on IR. Whereas if you know you're doing really well on IR, generally speaking, you get the harder first half in verbal and quant, then it could actually behoove you to spend less than half the time on that harder first half, because you don't need to get everything right, but then it'll be more important to spend more time on the second half of the section. This is the way the time management strategy tends to break out, depending on your performance and so on, the difficulty levels of the stages you're going to get. Yeah, this is indeed about the EA this time, you guys. I know, it's like, it's GMAT Club. How could it be about the EA? But it is. All right. You go on to quant. Again, a score on a scale of 2 to 18 points, first stage, review screen, second stage, end, essentially. And then if you're taking it in person, you get your score right away. Now, what do schools consider a decent score? So for most executive programs, at least here in the US and from what I know in Europe as well, they are looking for 150 if they can get it. For most programs, 150 is good enough. Now, you might notice on this score scale, 126 to 174, that indeed 150 is right there in the middle, all right? Which might make you think you need to get about half the questions correct. And to some degree, you would be absolutely right. You need to get probably half to 2/3 of the questions correct to get a 150. It's a little bit more than half. Now, how's your score calculated? So it's actually a really, really, really simple formula for calculating your score. Your overall score, you guys, is going to be 120 base points plus your IR score, plus your verbal score, plus your quant score. All right, which is why it's impossible to get lower than a 126, practically speaking, or impossible to get greater than 174, again, practically speaking, because each one of these sections is going to be 2, 2, and 2, or 18, 18, 18, or more likely somewhere in between. And so if we get, for instance, a 10, 10, 10, that score comes out to 150 on the dot. And a 10-10-10 is good enough for a lot of prominent programs. A lot of people are interested in applying, for instance, to Columbia's executive program, to MIT Sloan Fellows program, things like that. 150 is good enough for those programs, for Berkeley, for lots and lots of programs, LBS, for instance. There are a couple of programs, especially here in the US, that are a bit more demanding on your score. For instance, Wharton, I'm thinking about, Chicago Booth are the two that really leap to mind. When a school gets a bit more demanding about scores, they tend to want to see a higher quant score. Above all else, it's quant that matters to them. And so figuring out how to get a quant score at this level or higher is a big part of doing well on this test. It should also be noted that if you're considering using the executive assessment here to apply to full-time programs or to some degree part-time programs, then they tend to want to see an even higher score, but it's very few schools that are accepting the EA for full-time programs. I believe it's Columbia, NYU, and now perhaps Duke in the University of Virginia or somewhere, or Georgetown, somebody down there. But for the most part, this is for, of course, executive admissions. And for executive admissions, 150 is good enough for most schools, especially with a 10 or above in quant. Wharton and University of Chicago Booth want to see if they can get it a 12 or above in quant. Now, what effort does that really entail from you? Coming back to it, does that mean you need to miss about half the questions? What does it actually mean? It really depends on how these difficulties play out. So let me give you kind of two ranges. I said before that you could miss as many as half the questions, as much as half, but it could be that you need to get about 2/3 right to get to these 10 levels on each section, all right? The reason for that is indeed the different difficulties. So for instance, let's say you do okay on IR, you end up scoring an 11. You're gonna start in the medium section of verbal and quant then. Let's say you come to the quant section and you're starting in the medium difficulty range and you get the whole first half right. You get every question in that medium first half of quant right. You take a little extra time to do it maybe because you want to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's, but you get everything right. And then let's say you go on to the second half, which is now hard in quant, and you get every single question wrong. From what I've seen on practice tests, the official practice tests, which should score just like the real tests, that gets you a 10 in quant. So 50% of the questions, if you concentrate on getting the medium questions right, then you basically can float through the second half, get nothing right, and still do okay. And of course, if in that second half you focus on, say, 2 or 3 of the 7 questions and just get those 2 or 3 right on top of the first half that you got totally right, now your quant score is really taking off. Now it's going to be up to a 12, a 13, a 14 even. You do not have to get everything right to get a really good score, but you do have to be sure that you get the medium questions right, if indeed you're being given medium questions to get a really good score. Now, if you start shifting that a little bit, let's say you get the medium starting section in quant, right? And instead of getting all 7 of those questions right, you get 5 out of the 7 right. Well, then in all likelihood, you're getting the medium second half as well. And so let's say you go on to the medium second half, and this time you have a little bit more time left over, and there the questions are a bit easier. So you get 2 right there, but you get the other 5 wrong. Overall, you've still missed the same number of questions in quant. It was just a question of whether it was like 0 missed and then 7 missed, or 2 missed and then 5 missed. But the second way is going to get you a lower score. If you miss a couple in the first half and then miss, an equivalent or whatever number would bring you up to the same level in the second half, it still hurts you more to miss questions in the first half, assuming you're getting the easier medium first half of these sections again, which most people end up doing. All right. So you can get a 10, especially on quant, having missed half the questions. If you miss those half of the questions in a particularly specific way, all right? In practicality, to get a score of 10 reliably or 11 or so, you want to try to get, on the quant and verbal side, about 9 of the 14 questions correct, which means you can afford to miss about 5 of those 14 questions, which is no bad thing. On the IR side, to get a 10, you want to get probably about 8 of those 12 questions correct. All right, that's what we're looking at to get to that score level. And also, I appreciated that, and you're absolutely right. MIT Sloan accepts the EA for full-time MBA this year, at least. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? But MIT seems to really like the EA. And in truth, you guys, more and more schools are becoming accepting of the EA. A lot of them find it a really, really good way to admit candidates, because the truth is, around now, EA scores don't really have to be reported to ranking institutions. Schools haven't gathered enough data on EA scores either, because it's a relatively new test, to be able to say, okay, this kind of score correlates with great success in our programs, but this kind of score less so. So the way schools are looking at the EA, you guys, just in case you're, kind of at the beginning of the application process, the way schools look at the EA for a lot of, especially executive candidates, is they're happy to have the number on file. Taking a standardized test is part of most, undergraduate and graduate admissions, especially in the US. They're happy to have a score on file, but they're also happy that they don't have to report it, because as far as they're concerned, that means they can accept lower scores on the EA relative to the kinds of scores they would be accepting from GMAT applicants or GRE applicants. They can accept lower scores on the EA with impunity. Nobody knows. Nobody says, oh man, Chicago Booth is really, their average has fallen, because they don't have to report EA scores yet. And so a lot of schools are happy for an applicant to take the EA, because they'll be able to say, all right, well, your EA score is not that great, but thanks for taking it. See, your quant score is all right. We're going to evaluate you as a full candidate now. Basically, it's this funny time of compromise whereby the school technically asks for a score, but if you take the EA, doesn't worry too much about the score and can instead say, cool, we checked that box. Now let's look at undergraduate records. Let's look at work experience. Let's look at recommendations and essays. For executive programs, schools really do value the whole candidate. And if they want you as a candidate, if you're talking to them, they'll make it clear. They'll say, listen, just take the EA, wink, wink, just get a score, everything's going to be fine. And in my experience, if school tells you that, just get a score, we really like you as an applicant, they mean it. You get a halfway decent score, like 145 or above, and most schools are going to be okay with it, and they're going to be willing to work with you. But no matter what, you guys, schools are always going to be most worried about the quant score. Pretty much every school across the board that accepts the EA is looking at the quant score harder than it's looking at the IR score or the verbal score. All right, verbal is the least looked at of the three scores, and IR is kind of receiving middle of the road scrutiny. Okay, but the quant score is everything, which is to say, if you can get that quant score to 10, you're in pretty good shape. If you can get it to 11 or 12, you're in great shape. Even Wharton is really just asking for a 12. And if you can get any of these scores to 13 or above, that's really difficult to do, all right? Like, I've seen practice tests on which a person misses a single question in the integrated reasoning section, and the score drops from an 18 to a 13, just like that, just one question. I myself, when I took the real test, I scored a 15 on the IR section, and I thought, wow, it didn't feel like it was that hard. I didn't realize I'd missed so many questions to drop from an 18 to a 15. Turned out, later on, I came to realize I probably missed one question, and it was probably a decently difficult question for it only to have lopped 3 points off my score, because basically there's a steep fall off at the top end of scores. It's very hard to score 13 or above on these sections, which means that it's incredibly hard on the EA to score 160 or above. It's, in my years, it's only happened for a handful of people. It's really, really difficult to score that high. But schools don't care that much, not yet anyway. So if you're considering applying with the EA, do it sooner rather than later, before schools start saying, you know what, let's try to make everybody score a 157, the way, schools kind of de facto have with 700s on the GMAT. All right, get it while the getting's good, you guys. Yeah, I agree that this is what's good about the EA versus GMAT. Just concentration overall, the fact that it's such a shorter test, right? Like, it's an hour and a half, 90 minutes long. That's, not so much longer than just one of the sections on the GMAT, right? This test is half the length and even less than half the length of the GMAT, which makes concentration really doable. And the fact that you can move back and forth and like choose which battles you fight, it's amazing. It's a really, really lovely test to take. If you have to take a test, you guys, the EA is a really good choice. Now, ask any questions you have about the structure overall, you guys, while we're here, or the scoring. Put them out in the comments window and I'll try to pick up on them. I'm going to go on to talk about some of the contents of each of these sections, so you know what you're getting yourselves into with them. And of course, keep the questions coming throughout, you guys. All right. how would I rate? That's a great question, Dylan. The EA is by and large a less difficult test than the GMAT. It is, so let's use the GMAT official guide as an example. For those of you who know, and for those of you who don't, in fact, the GMAT official guide is this big book that the GMAT people put out every year, contains hundreds of practice questions. These are retired questions from past actual GMAT exams. And the EA resources copy a lot from the GMAT resources. The two, of course, are administered by the same company, and there's a lot of cross-pollination there. But what I've noticed is the official guide goes in order of difficulty. The later questions in a section are by and large harder than the earlier questions in a section. And those later questions, they're going to show up on the GMAT. Questions of that difficulty will show up a little bit on the GMAT, the 700 to 800 level difficulty questions, but they are virtually absent from the EA. So in GMAT terms, on the EA, you're getting up to about 600 to 700 level difficulty at the hardest. You don't see a lot of super difficult questions, which means on the whole, the EA is a little bit easier on quant, okay? IR is roughly the same, but the EA still has the advantage because you can move back and forth in the IR section. But in my experience, the difficulty is indistinguishable between the GMAT's IR section and the EA's IR section. And it may be like a tiny bit harder on the EA because there's a chance you get that harder second half. But in truth, I found the GMAT's IR section hard too because of its unpredictability in terms of difficulty. At least if you're going in, you've taken some practice tests, you know you're going into the harder second half, you can prepare for that. You've got a strategy for that. But on the GMAT, you could have done a really hard question just a minute ago and then get a ridiculously easy question, except you're probably going to treat it as though it's a really hard question because you don't know that it's an easy question. And so the GMAT's kind of unevenness and difficulty on the IR section I found always a little bit troubling. Verbal, however, may be a bit harder on the EA than on the GMAT, or at least this is what I found. Critical reasoning is probably a bit easier. Reading comprehension is on par with the GMAT, though I've not seen them hit anybody with super technical science passages. So if you're a person who's afraid of super technical science passages or a person who loves them and looks forward to them, you're either in luck or out of luck. Okay, you'll get some light science passages, some macro science passages, you know, big world science, but usually not, let's say, microbiology passages, though theoretically they're in the scope. You might get a humanities passage, you might get a history, you know, or a business passage, but they tend to focus more on macro sciences and humanities for whatever reason. So reading comprehension is on par with GMAT reading comprehension. Sentence correction, though, in my experience, and you know, this is my opinion, your results may totally vary and it'll depend on what your skills and talents are with sentence correction. I thought sentence correction on the EA was harder than sentence correction on the GMAT for one major reason. I know a lot of the sentence correction rules, and we may touch on them in just a few minutes. I know grammar pretty well, and grammar's gotten me by on the GMAT. And the last time I took a GMAT, for instance, I was able to use parallelism, for those of you who have been studying sentence correction a while, to get through like 10 of the questions. And if you knew parallelism well, you'd often get down to a single answer on those GMAT questions, on my last official GMAT, that is. On the EA, though, what I noticed is this. On my personal EA, I had 6 sentence correction questions, and most of them, like a big majority, were testing comparisons, okay? And I could use my comparison skills on those questions, but invariably, my comparison skills would get it narrowed down to 2 or 3 answer choices. There were going to be 2 or 3 that did the comparison well, and from that point, I was basically stuck with either sentence structure, that's a hard topic, or idioms, which tend to be everybody's least favorite topic. I find that the EA sentence correction relies more on idioms, modifiers, word order, word choice, things like that. Things that are a bit harder to study for and a bit harder to put your finger on. So in that respect, the verbal section might be a little bit harder, or, you know, not as friendly as the GMAT's verbal section. But on the other hand, on this verbal section, you can miss about half the questions and still expect to get a good score, a 10 or above on verbal. That is not the case on the GMAT. On the GMAT, as many of you guys may know, the verbal section is scored really, really strictly, especially at the top ends. If you miss 5 or 6 questions in verbal, you're getting a 40 or below as your verbal score in all likelihood on the GMAT. But if you miss 5 or 6 questions on this verbal section, out of 14, mind you, not out of 36, you're probably getting an 11 or 12 in verbal. You get a good score. All right. All right, I'm seeing a lot of these questions. I'm going to scroll up and try to answer them. Question format is totally similar to the GMAT questions for each section. And by totally similar, I mean exactly the same. There is no difference in question formats. The only difference in format is like the review screen, the ability to move back and forth, but sentence correction on the EA looks just like sentence correction on the GMAT. The IR section, all the question types look exactly the same between the two tests, and same for quant. This was in response to the calibers question. Pranjal, quick comparison between GMAT and EA. Indeed, luckily I've been on that, but if you have specific questions about that comparison, let me know and I will definitely give them to you. It is not necessary, in response to Anuradha's question, it's not necessary to answer all the questions in the EA. And something I kind of said in passing earlier, but I didn't make explicit. I want to make explicit now, you guys. It's not necessary to answer all the questions on the EA at all, but there's no penalty for guessing versus just leaving a question blank. So if you're running out of time, if you're not going to attempt every question anyway, you should still put in guesses for those questions that you don't want to attempt, because who knows, maybe you get it right. Like there's a 20% chance on quant or verbal that you get that question right. Your odds drop a little bit on IR, but it's still worth it to put in a guess. All right. Question, how much time do you think is sufficient to prepare for an average candidate who has not done any quant for maybe 7-8 years? It's a great question. It's one of the big questions, of course, people wonder. Depending on how much time you have to study, but let's say you have on average about an hour a day that you can devote to studying. In all likelihood, that probably means, if you haven't done quant in 7 or 8 years, probably means you're looking to study for about 2 months. I would say an hour a day, 2 to 3 months would be enough time. Now, it really depends, of course, on just natural quantitative skills. But if you haven't touched quant in 7 or 8 years, you've been doing all your quant through, say, Excel or, whatever quant comes up, you do with a calculator or something like that, then yeah, it's going to take a while. And in those 2 or 3 months, you spend the first couple of weeks probably just getting the arithmetic rules back under your belts, working with fractions, doing calculations in your mind. Because of course, while you have a calculator on the IR section, again, you don't have it on the quant section. So you're going to have to be doing actual arithmetic. And it may have been a while since you've had to add numbers in your head or on paper, multiply numbers, divide numbers, things like that. You shouldn't have to be doing a huge amount of that stuff. The GMAT tends, or the EA, both tend to give you fairly round numbers to cut down on the difficulty of calculations in the quant section. But probably 2 or 3 months, you're going to need to relearn some rules. And I'm going to talk in just a couple minutes actually about what the major topics on the quant section are, you guys, so you know which ones to really focus on as you're studying. But yeah, an hour a day, I'd say 2 or 3 months is probably good. And take a practice test fairly early on. Now, the annoying thing about the EA is there aren't that many free practice tests available. The best practice tests are the official EA practice tests, but they charge you for them. All right. That said, you might find that it's worth paying anyway. If you're studying for the EA, you're probably going to make that purchase at some point, unless you are joining a class with a private company like ours, in which case it tends to be provided for you. But if you're studying on your own, you're going to want to purchase those practice tests at some point. And even though it might seem counterintuitive, take one fairly early on in your process. One thing I've noticed across the board for EA students is 90% of them, I would say, do better on their first practice test than they expect to. All right. The number of students I've had who right out the gate are scoring 148, 149, 150, 152, things like that, it's pretty high. All right. It's actually like, you may find that even if it's been a while since you've been at these topics or been a while since you've taken a standardized test, that with a little bit of studying, you take a practice test, you're actually in pretty good shape. Okay. 150 is not a super high threshold to cross. It tends to correspond, honestly, and there's some variability here, but it tends to correspond to something around a 550 in GMAT terms. All right, it's not a huge score. It's not a huge ask. So take a practice test early on in your study process, and you might find that you can cut down on your study time immensely just by doing better than you might expect to. All right. I could probably, Gypsy, find a list of schools that accept EA for their full-time MBA program. I believe it's MIT Sloan Fellows and Columbia, NYU, Duke, and I think it is Georgetown, but I'll do a quick background search, or I mean, Google it too, and they'll tell you. There is a list on the EA website of schools that accept it, but I think that one's always a little bit behind, especially given that some of these schools are accepting EA for full-time applicants just for the first time this year, and it's kind of a school-by-school decision. But I know those ones to start with, and I tend to get, honestly, this information from students themselves who are interested in applying. They're like, hey, they're actually accepting it for this. And I say, no, they're not. You're a liar. But it turns out they're totally telling the truth. I'm seeing then your next question. Yeah, verbal concentration is super low. It's great news. And again, as long as you get like an 8 really or above in verbal, schools don't tend to ask any questions about it. As long as your overall score then ends up being in the 150s, especially a slightly lower score in verbal won't cause you too much difficulty. Like if you're going to get an 8 in any one of these 3 sections for an application, verbal is definitely the one to do it in, because schools take integrated reasoning a bit more seriously on the whole than verbal, and of course quant the most seriously. Rohit asks how real test questions relate with the EA practice test material questions in terms of difficulty. And the truth is they're pretty good. I've found that maybe the practice questions, if we're talking about the EA official practice questions, this is another product that the EA people put out, just like their practice tests. It gives you 100 IR, 100 verbal, 100 quant questions. What I've found from my students is that those practice questions skew a little bit harder than the test questions, the practice test questions especially. However, what I've also heard from my students lately, and it's been obviously a couple of years since I've taken the test, I can't confirm this one way or the other myself, but what I've heard is that the actual EA has been feeling a little bit harder to them than the practice test. So it may well be that the actual EA is going to have questions that difficulty-wise are on par with the practice tool questions. But even so, the actual EA will not have questions as hard as what you'll see on the GMAT. You guys, I'll reiterate that. So the practice materials are probably pretty good preparation for the real EA, or a bit of over preparation in some case for the real EA. And I find if that's most true anywhere, it tends to be most true on the integrated reasoning materials. Those ones in the EA practice tool are definitely harder in some significant ways than the actual EA integrated reasoning section. The official material Pranjal for the EA is on the EA website. I think it's like eaofficialprep.gmac.com or something like that. They'll sell you packages of practice tests, of practice questions, and so on. But that said, for just day-to-day studying purposes, probably the best and most cost-effective resource is actually still the GMAT official guide, just because you get 900 to 1,000 questions in that these days versus the 300 questions you're getting from the EA practice tool. Now, the one advantage the EA practice tool has over the GMAT official guide is it has more integrated reasoning questions. It gives you 100, whereas the GMAT official guide, I think, comes bundled with about 50 IR questions. But in all other respects, the GMAT official guide is the better tool, not only because it has more questions of each type, but because you can search it. Like if you want to focus on divisibility questions for a while, for instance, which is a good thing to be able to do when you're studying for a test like this. Like you don't want to just be doing random questions all the time. You want to every now and then be able to concentrate on one question type, learn from question to question, and feel yourself getting better at a question type. The EA practice tool is not great for that because it's only equipped to give you random questions from random and scattered topics all the time. But the official guide, the GMAT official guide, whether it's on paper or it's the ebook version, you can just search through that for divisibility problem. Now let me go to the next divisibility problem. Now the next one. And so you can use it to concentrate a little more ably on topics there. And of course, private companies like ours, like Kaplan, Veritas and things, they'll put out instructional materials for GMAT, which will translate to the EA. One point of comparison between GMAT and EA that I forgot to mention before you guys, but I'm going to get to kind of de facto anyway when I talk about what's on the quant section. There is no geometry on the EA, right? This is one of the things they famously say and that people really pick up on about the EA, but if you haven't heard the good news yet, there's no geometry on the EA, with the exception of coordinate plane stuff, because the EA considers coordinate plane stuff algebra rather than geometry. So if you happen to consider that geometry, then that geometry might be on the test. We're talking about XY coordinate plane, plotting points, finding distances between points, slopes, and stuff like that. That's the only thing that's even vaguely geometric on the EA, aside from, of course, the graphs and stuff in the integrated reasoning section. Thank you, GMAT Club. There we go. Our EA material is there in the comments window, and the official EA material you'll find at mba.com. If you go there, the same site for the GMAT, and click the right links, they'll take you to their EA portal. They want to sell you their stuff. They love it. All right. Let's see. We've got about 14 minutes left, you guys. Keep the questions coming in, because if nothing else, I want to be able to answer your questions while I'm here and live. Keep them coming. I appreciate them a lot. All right. But I also want to talk to you guys a little bit about the content of each of these sections, just so you know what you're getting yourself into, and so you know kind of what to study, especially for quant and verbal. All right. IR section looks like this, just to preface it. This is the integrated reasoning section. It looks like this. It doesn't actually look like this. This would be a fun visualization, but this is the composition of the IR section. You're going to get one MSR prompt, multi-source reasoning, so-called, because you're going to get 2 or 3 tabs of information up here. And this will come attached to 3 separate standalone questions. One traditional multiple choice question, the only traditional multiple choice question on the entire IR section, which is to say 5 answer choices, you choose one and hope it's the right one. And then 2, what they call here either or questions. I call them 3-part questions, where they'll give you a yes and a no, or a true and a false, and you decide whether each of these statements is true based on something reported here in these tabs or not. Meaning you're selecting false if it's been contradicted, the statement's been contradicted by the information in the tabs, but you're also choosing false if the statement simply has no clear basis. May be true, may not be true, but the tabs can't fully support it. All right. In these 3-part questions, you guys, and throughout the IR section, because you can see these ones down here have 2 parts, you have to get each part of that problem right to get credit for that problem. So if you get statement 1 and statement 2 correct, but you mess up statement 3, you get 0 credit for that whole problem. Now, on the MSR, the multi-source reasoning, this problem is going to be separate from this problem, and this other 3-part question is going to be separate still. So you can miss one of those 3 questions in IR and still get credit for the other 2, but within any one question that happens to be on your screen at any given moment, 3-part or 2-part, you have to get every part correct to get credit for the question, which seems kind of unfair. It seems like, well, couldn't they just give me partial credit? But the truth is, what I find, if they give you, say, a 3-part question like this, one of those 3 parts is going to be harder than the other 2 parts. And so it wouldn't necessarily be fair to give you 2/3 credit for a question if you get the 2 easier parts right, but mess up the hardest part. As far as they're concerned, a question is as difficult as its hardest part. And the hardest sub-question within a question is more or less the reason they gave you that problem to begin with. So even though you kind of like nominally have to answer 3 questions or 2 questions per, in a sense, they're asking you one real thing and then some other maybe distractions or throwaway things. All right. In terms of content, like what kind of stuff you need to know to do well on the IR section, there's going to be a lot of quant here. And specifically, so for these like 2 table questions, one will be math-based, and we're talking about statistics usually for table questions, averages, medians, ranges. Knowing definitions like those can really help you on those. Even standard deviation comes up on some of the table questions, but they're not going to be asking you to do a lot of math on these table questions. Even if it looks like they're asking you to do a lot of math, they're not really asking you to do a lot of math. There's going to be some sort of shortcut or a way to estimate that will really help. And you can sort the tables as well, and that can really help. Mahesh, that's a great question. Are there like experimental questions on this test? By all accounts, yes, there should be, but they're kind of cagey about which ones those are. And there hasn't been enough experimentation on private companies' part to find out what the truth of it is, because you can only take the EA twice in your lifetime, basically. So unlike on the GMAT, where we used to be able to go in like 10 times and take the test and do weird experiments, you don't really have the opportunity for the EA. By the way, you guys, that's nominally the case that you can only take the EA twice in your lifetime. However, right now, while there's still the EA at home option alongside the EA in-person option, you can actually take it up to 4 times. You can take it up to 2 times from home and separately 2 times in person. And so if you know you're probably going to end up taking it multiple times, now could be a good time to take it while you have this kind of rare opportunity to have 4 attempts at the EA. Each time costs you $350 US, possibly plus taxes or VAT, depending on where you are. So it's certainly not something you want to be taking multiple times if you can avoid it. But if that's part of your strategy, if that's kind of how you were going about the GMAT, if you were doing that, now is a good time to take it if you want to take it multiple times. All right. But yeah, the answer is I'm pretty sure there are, because basically the only way they can call half a section harder or medium or easier, the only way they can have an adaptive test is if they've tested out questions on test takers to get a sense of how hard or easy the question is, which is to say they're not arbitrarily assigning a difficulty level to these questions. They're doing it very democratically using those test/pilot questions. So yeah, I would be surprised if there weren't any experimental questions on this one, but it's going to be a fairly small number if there are any. And there is the outside chance that they're using GMAT experimental questions to inform what they put on the EA. I strongly doubt it. I think they've got their own experimental questions. The IR is CAT-based a little bit. Like I said, the second stage on IR is going to be harder, medium, or easier, depending on how you do on the first stage. So the first stage, less so. They're just going to give you a mix of difficulties on IR, the first 6 questions, mix of difficulties. But the second group of 6 questions adapts to how you do on the first group of 6 questions. All right. In terms of content, again, you're going to have one mathy table and then one logic-based table. All right, and that's going to hold true throughout these question types. So you're going to have 3 graph questions scattered throughout. 1 will be math. There will be typically like a normal looking graph question, like the kind of graph you would have seen before, like this one, for instance, a scatter plot with a line of best fit. Usually then the question that they give you is going to be highly mathematical. There's going to be one weird looking one where they just choose to present normal information in a way you would have never seen it presented in before. And there the challenge is seeing if you can figure out what the graph actually means and what it's actually saying. Don't be too intimidated by it. You can leave it and come back to it. Just know, you guys, that there's going to be one graph question on the test that is deliberately there to look weird and throw you off your game. Expecting it, you can know to skip it strategically, or you can know that it's really about that initial fear, like seeing if you can get past the initial intimidation of the graph. If you can figure out how to read it properly, the questions on that one are usually pretty easy. And there's going to be one logic-based one as well. Sometimes those graph questions are just words, the logic-based ones. Sometimes they're flowcharts or things like that. But in all logic-based questions, whether it's tables, graphs, or 2-part questions where you'll have 2 math, 1 verbal, kind of verbal-based questions, like a critical reasoning style question or something, and 1 logic. In all the logic-based questions across question formats, what they're really going to do is give you a set of rules and ask you to apply that set of rules. They'll give you that set of rules in words and ask you to apply that set of rules to a group of answer choices, to a table, to a graph, okay? Guys, my single best piece of advice on the IR section is read it in pieces, okay? Do not get in the habit. So these tables will, especially the logic-based ones, come with a little paragraph explaining the table. These graphs will come with a little blurb explaining the graph. These 2-part questions will always come with a little paragraph. Don't get in the habit of reading the paragraph all the way through and then looking at the table or then looking at the graph. You're toast if you do that. Instead, read 1 sentence of the blurb, even half a sentence, and then pause and say, okay, where's that showing up on the table? Where's that showing up on the graph? Find where it's talking about. Once you've mapped it, then come back, read the next sentence, pause, map it to the table or graph, or look at the answer choices and think about what it means for them, and then come back and read the next sentence, okay? Read IR in pieces. Do not read whole sentences, especially whole paragraphs, in one straight shot. There's too much information. The information is presented in too dense a way in IR to be able to get away with that, okay? Single best piece of advice, read it in pieces. Next best piece of advice, you guys, use some extra time on the MSR. MSR is always going to come in the first half of the IR section. It's always in the first stage, where we said questions tend to be more important anyway. And it could take you, it should take you at least 7.5 minutes. You have about 2.5 minutes per question on average in IR. But if you end up spending 10 minutes on MSR, it's worth it. You want to get MSR right. There is, Mahesh, great question. There is no possibility of switching the orders of these sections on the EA. On the EA, order is fixed. Unlike on the GMAT, where you can select your order if you're taking it in person, not if you're taking it online. On the EA, order is totally fixed in place. All right, there you go. Now, when we talk about the math questions in two parts, we're talking about, again, statistics questions, rate questions, ratio questions, word problems, especially. Great question. Rohit asks how verbal is structured in terms of the 3 question types. So indeed, if you didn't know, verbal has those 3 question types: sentence correction, reading comprehension, and critical reasoning. The crucial thing is that reading comprehension is always in the first half, and let's ignore that. And so is definitely going to be important. Reading comprehension, even if you're studying for the GMAT, you guys, reading comprehension is the most important question type to get right in verbal. That holds true on the EA as well, but doubly so because reading comprehension shows up in the first half of the verbal section, where we said generally for most test takers, unless you're doing extraordinarily well on IR in general, you're going to want to be taking extra time in the first half and making sure you get everything right. And that's partly making sure you get reading comprehension right, okay? It's like MSR is on the IR section. Get reading comprehension right. Now, format-wise, you're going to get 4 problems in reading comprehension. They're going to give you a passage, and one by one, the questions will come up on the right side of the screen. The passage will stay on the screen as long as there are questions about it. And then the rest, you'll have probably about 6 sentence correction questions, about 4 critical reasoning questions. Those 4 critical reasoning questions will tend to be assumption-based. 3 at least of the 4 will be. We're talking about find the assumption, strengthen the argument, weaken the argument, and evaluate the argument. In fact, all 4 of my questions, I had 1 of each of those types. And that's pretty much the norm. And then about 6 sentence correction questions, where the biggest topics tested tend to be parallelism, comparisons, modifiers. But like I said, idioms and word choice get a huge opportunity to ruin your life, basically, in the verbal section. And those are really hard to prepare for. The second half of verbal will be all critical reasoning and sentence correction. And what'll usually happen is the first half of verbal, you get 4 reading comprehension questions, 2 sentence correction questions, and 1 critical reasoning question. And then the other 4 or so sentence correction questions and the other 3 critical reasoning questions come in the second half, and they're all scattered about. The order can change. All right. And finally, how much time for MSR questions? About 7.5 to 10 minutes for the 3 questions and the reading and all of those things. There's only 1 reading comprehension passage on the verbal section, only 1 with 4 questions. All right. In terms of the verbal content, there's not much difference between the EA and the GMAT. Like, it's going to feel about the same question type, same question formats on the verbal section. I mean, Solid Wolf 34, these are the important questions of our time. And if I had an answer, man, I'd give it to you if I were a Detroit expert. Quant section, last thing, you guys. You're going to get about half and half problem solving versus data sufficiency. As many of you guys know, data sufficiency is this question type in which you have to determine whether you are given enough information to solve the problem, but you don't actually have to solve the problem. No calculator on quant, and these question types are randomly interspersed, so you'll get problem solving, then data sufficiency, then back to problem solving, another data sufficiency. You're not going to get like all your problem solvings and then all your data sufficiencies. Major topics tested, you guys, are the reason I wanted to come to this screen before we ended it, which of course we are right about to do. We're a minute away. Screen capture this if you want to. If you're studying for the test and you're looking to spend your 2 or 3 months studying, an hour a day for quant, these are the big topics to study. These are the ones that are going to come up time and time again. Now, these are not the only question types that will ever come up. Every now and then you'll see, for instance, a quadratics question or a decimals question or, a consecutive integers question, but incredibly rarely. And you can probably afford to take the hit on those when they come up. The same is true actually for probability on word problems. But all these other topics, they come up pretty frequently. And I've listed them roughly in order of importance within each topic as well. Like fractions, ratios, and percents are all important, but divisibility, a bit less important on the EA than it is on the GMAT, honestly. Equations are super important in inequalities, but exponents and roots, again, a bit less important on the EA than they are on the GMAT. Rates and work always come up. Statistics always come up on the EA for whatever reason, but overlapping sets, somewhat more than probability. All right. So true. Big D stands for Big Detroit. All right, you guys. I believe that is the end of our time. I hope you found this helpful. If you guys have follow-up questions, GMAT Club moderator Abhijit is putting good stuff out in the comments. My email address is on the screen. Again, I am Ryan, and it was really nice to teach you guys this thing today. Feel free to email me, ask more questions. I've got more answers, but they're mostly going to be made up. And have a great day or night, wherever you may happen to be, you guys. Thank you.